What if there were a town with views like this, a small but dense urban core, and oh yeah, what if that town also happened to have some of the best cycling infrastructure in all of Germany? Well, this hypothetical, in fact, exists in the small German city of Konstanz. When my wife and I visited for the first time this summer, we fell in love with it. Laid back promenades, a charming old city, cool water, pleasant breezes, mountains in the distance, and a laid back atmosphere that exists eternally on holiday. And above all that, I discovered probably the best cycling infrastructure that I've personally experienced. But don't take my word for it. Upon returning home after that first weekend, I discovered that ADFC members rank the city as the fourth best city with between 50 and 100,000 residents in all of Germany. So they're clearly doing something right. But first, a reminder to stick around to the end for an announcement about the community which I'm launching. During my first visit to the city, I decided just to enjoy my time and didn't film anything. Upon returning home and doing some research, I realized that I had to return. The ADFC, or the Allgemeines Deutschland Fahrradclub, basically the bike lobby, runs an annual survey of its members to rank their cities on various topics using the German GPA system, which is inverted from the US, meaning a 1.0 is the best score and a 4.0 is the worst. Looking at the ranking of Konstanz, despite it and most cities in Germany being between a 3 and a 4, Konstanz has, for example, a 3.3 overall, it still stands out as being better than the rest. So a few weeks before my Bahncard 100 expired, I loaded up the bike and set off on the very long 3.5 hour train trip from Heidelberg down to the city of Konstanz, located here on the Swiss border. Upon arriving in Konstanz on this second trip, I decided to begin in the same location as my first trip. Rather than exiting the train at the central station, I alighted just outside at Petershausen. This part of the city was much more pleasant than Google Maps had led me to believe. What looked like an industrial park from above was actually modern and bright, with old buildings and good cycling infrastructure sprinkled in. While the choice had been random the first time, I realized that a massive bike trail parallels this section of double track for quite a long ways. It is super useful for those who commute with S-Bahn or train and bikes to reach destinations which are perhaps located between two of the stops. It serves as a main artery for entering the city from the north or west by bike or by rail. At many points, it is also possible to turn off the main trail to reach local destinations or to take a bridge over the tracks. And this was only the beginning. Although we will return to these surprising areas, I first want to show you where I felt that the infrastructure was the best and where I enjoyed being the most. In a city largely visited by tourists, but also populated by students, it is important to have access to waterfront leisure destinations. While many tourists that visit the region go to the beaches sprinkled around the lake, which are also reachable by bike, I realize that most students and locals spend their time at a few parks and promenades where the Rhine exits Lake Konstanz. It isn't somewhere you'd normally visit if you were traveling to get here, but my wife and I had a great time spending hours by and in the water. For the first time in my life, I discovered a new freedom, biking directly to the waterfront in my bathing suit and jumping right in. Then afterwards, sitting on a bench and reading a book. The infrastructure to take you to these places is a mixture of raised cycle tracks and trails, as well as this cycling bridge over the Rhine. And if you decide you want to move to a different swimming spot, it's super easy to do so, as many trails parallel the river, even being mixed use. Another great thing about Konstanz's waterfront are the cafes and restaurants we found with direct biking access. This was super useful when my wife and I wanted to get pizza without going all the way into the city or leaving our spot to watch the sunset. But as we saw earlier, it isn't just the waterfront that's great. The biking is also great on many residential and water parallel streets. I saw people biking to and fro of all ages. Young and old seem to feel comfortable getting around the city in this way. Both times that I've been in Konstanz, I've had to bike to either the supermarket or to pick up food and found it incredibly easy to do so. When you leave the dedicated bike trails off of the water, you enter raised cycle tracks that line most of the major streets off of the water. And if you need to go down a residential street, it is likely to be some sort of Fahrradstraße, bike street, or two-way biking on a one-way street. The first time that I was in Konstanz, my wife and I stayed overnight at a budget hotel on the outskirts of the city. I was worried about getting into the city from there, but we had dedicated cycle tracks and bridges the whole way. Not only that, but reaching the hotel from the train station, also in the outskirts, was made easy as the biking trail had an exit right where we needed, which connected to the raised cycle tracks the entire way to the hotel. And the hotel actually had dedicated bike parking underground, which was super great for our peace of mind. I also noticed that the adjacent industrial park were well linked to the cycling network, which is something Germany does not traditionally do very well. And this is not just me cherry picking a few good examples. In my 2 trips to the city, I would just find a destination on Google Maps and be able to easily reach it without leaving some sort of intentional infrastructure. It could, of course, be better, but the locals would have to tell you specifically about how. Despite having many types of good infrastructure, including raised cycle tracks, separated bike trails, biking streets, and more, what impressed me most were the intersections and the bridges. This is usually where a city, especially a smaller one like Konstanz, will struggle because it is expensive to retrofit or custom build bridges. My opinion on bridges is that when you want to deconflict a major road without angering motorists and therefore generating pushback, they are the best way to do so. But Konstanz does this better than any other city of the size that I've ever seen or researched. Outside of the Netherlands, of course. In the city center, whenever possible, cyclists and pedestrians cross over or under streets using bridges. And the design is such to allow bike traffic flow to continue at speed with little interruption. This also makes crossing safer for cyclists and vehicles, although pedestrians will need to be careful when using the same underpasses. That said, the underpasses have well-marked junctions of their own and facilitate a large volume of users. And it isn't just the repurposing of existing bridges that I found interesting. There are also a large number of dedicated bridges just for cyclists and pedestrians. The prime example is this one over the Rhine, built in the 1990s, but there are so many more which show that the city is really trying to get this right. And although I didn't witness so many of them personally, there are quite a few well-designed intersections in the city as well, which complement the bridges when you can't or don't need an expensive overpass. This point about the bridges and intersections brings me to the core of why Konstanz is a truly great biking city. It strives to deconflict different modes of transportation from one another and seems to have pushed through improvements without getting blocked, as seems to be an issue in so many cities around the world. It makes me wonder if the increased number of leisure cyclists and Konstanz's focus on tourism has actually helped gain good infrastructure for tourists and locals alike. This leads to my second point, that tourism can be co-opted to make things better for locals as well. Great infrastructure ideas do not matter if you can't make them happen, so using tourism or something else super important to the local economy is not always a bad idea. And here I think that it's also important to highlight a difference between two similar concepts with similar but different needs. Cycling for sport or leisure versus cycling to reach sport or leisure. While you may think that both are the same, cycling for sport or leisure is what most people think of when they think of the term cycling. These are your road cyclists, mountain bikers, and kids biking in some sort of loop. They end most journeys where they begin and are less concerned with how good the infrastructure is, as they are often not biking unless the weather is good or when they don't need to get somewhere. Road cyclists will often have more speed and engage in vehicular cycling, while mountain bikers and kids are less likely to conflict with roadways by design. On the other hand, cycling to reach a sport or leisure destination means that a cyclist is substituting a vehicle trip to reach somewhere like a beach or a gym. And this type of cycling has much in common with bike commuting in that it benefits from good deconfliction from vehicle traffic. If towns only consider cycling for leisure in building their infrastructure, they will focus on low-hanging fruit like sharrows or painted bike gutters, lanes, or bike trails which take you outside of the city or in a very indirect route. Although Konstanz has this, it also has so much more. What I learned in Konstanz is that while you'd think the infrastructure is geared towards those cycling for leisure or sport, it is actually intended to help tourists and locals reach sport and leisure destinations, with most spots on the lake or river being well connected and reachable by bike. Making good infrastructure to reach leisure destinations has been an excuse to make the infrastructure better overall. This type of cycling has the added benefit of reducing single vehicle traffic as well, and I'm sure that most of us have visited lakes or national forests in the summer only to spend hours in traffic. I don't know about you, but that's not how I'd like to begin or end my holidays. Thank you for sticking around to the end of the video. I'm sure that I'll get a lot of pushback from locals about being too positive, but I think it's important to realize and to congratulate them on what they've managed to do thus far. And if you stayed around this far in the video, this message is probably addressed to you. Recently, I've launched a Patreon, and I'm looking for interested viewers like yourself to join. I'm trying to build a community, not asking for support. I want a movement of people in small towns who are interested in building good urbanism, cycling infrastructure, and transit. So if you'd like to join me and join this movement, check out the link to my Patreon in the description below. Bye for now.